Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Chris Agard, and I'm one of your 3 Fellows for the year. After a long and oftentimes turbulent 4 years, the country's population will collectively decide the future course of our nation tomorrow in various federal, state, and local elections. Without a doubt, all eyes will be on the presidential election. In what is billed as a referendum on Donald Trump, the stakes this year seem exceptionally high, with many anticipating drama, confusion, and perhaps unrest in the coming days. However, it is important to note that there are many other important battles on ballots nationwide that will reach their conclusions tomorrow. Across the country, millions of Americans will exercise their democratic right to have a voice in the future of their cities, states, and country. Tonight, a panel of government and politics professors joins us to discuss the presidential election and other key races. Panelists include Claremont McKenna College professors Jack Pitney, whose areas of expertise include California politics, national elections, and the presidency, and Professor Andrew Sinclair, whose areas of expertise include public policy and the relationships between voters, elected politicians, and bureaucrats. Additionally, we have Pomona College professor Sara Sadhwani, whose areas of expertise include Asian American and Latino voting behavior, elections, interest groups, and representation. Professor Zachary Corsair, CMC Visiting Assistant, Professor of Government, and Co-Director of the CMC Policy Lab, will moderate the panel discussion. Using the Q&A function, we will accept questions throughout the program to be posed towards the end of the event. Preference will go to students, so when you send in a question, please state your affiliation with the college, student, faculty, parent, alumni, friend. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professor Zachary Corsair, Jack Pitney, Sara Sadhwani, and Andrew Sinclair to the Athenaeum.
Thanks so much, Chris, for that introduction, and thanks to our panelists, and thanks to you for coming here tonight. Some of you might be returning from 2016 in our Athenaeum election night panel, which was somewhat legendary. We were just talking about that earlier before we started. Tonight, I think we could probably think about our discussion as something of a survival guide for election night. We're actually talking about the election the day before to give you some insights and ideas about what to expect, how to interpret early results, how to think about watching the election, and trying to give you some context. We really look forward, though, to getting your questions for as much as we'd love to talk to you. I put in for a grant for about $40,000 so each of us could have a CNN-style magic screen behind us. That was denied, unfortunately, by the Athenaeum. So what we'll be doing is if we have a visualization or a map that we'd like to share with you tonight, we'll actually just be sharing our screens because I think by now we're pretty much all used to the Zoom format. So welcome to our webinar. The last 20 minutes will be set aside for questions. So as you're listening to us talk about what we think is going to happen or discuss the presidential election or what's happening and with Senate races, please feel free to submit your questions as we continue to talk. And then for the last 20 minutes, we will address those questions. So we really look forward to getting your feedback. So don't forget, as we move along here, please do submit your questions. So the first place I want to start tonight, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen first. I'm going to put up this and I'm going to look at, maybe a lot of you have seen this from the Washington Post. It's a really interesting visualization of early voting. And it's surprising. And this is something that's been in the headlines that people are just talking about a lot. How do we think about all of this early voting? We can see, for instance, probably the most surprising result, something that we've seen in endless newspaper articles the last few days, is Texas. As we can see here, the purple color means that over 100% of the total votes cast in 2016 in the particular state have already been cast as early ballots. And I think those of you who have been following the election closely know that Texas is probably one of the hardest states actually to cast an absentee ballot. They make things pretty difficult. And there was a discussion also about how the governor and Republicans in the states had tried to limit returns for ballots to one location per county. So despite these limitations, Texans are voting in droves. We've also got Montana. We'll obviously have a chance to talk about Steve Bullock later, CMC alum. We'll probably give him a little special focus when we talk about Senate races. But already there we see 100% of voting. And of course here In California, 77%. So the question is, people are talking about, there's a dearth of elections data as we head into elections day, and we're always scrambling for numbers. Tell us what's going to happen. And we see these early numbers and they're kind of tantalizing in a way. Can we say that early returns are predictors in some way of outcomes? Are they misleading? So it's the first question I want to put out to our group. Feel free, any of you, Andrew, John, Sarah, if you'd like to answer this question. How should we be thinking about this incredible early turnout? Does this tell us anything about a probable result? I'll go at once here. Andrew.
Sure. Yeah, I think so. One of the things I do a fair amount of is working on executing polls, and it's the sort of thing that makes me nervous because one of the challenges that's a big part of doing polling is trying to figure out who you want to ask who they're going to vote for, right? That likely voter definition. And anytime you get really big shifts in voter turnout, it raises the possibility that your understanding of who's a likely voter could be potentially off one way or another for that election cycle. So thanks this year in part to some funding from the Dean's Office at CMC and from the Rose Institute, we actually just got a poll back from the field, I guess now about 10 days ago. And we had Joe Biden winning in Texas. And I wasn't really quite sure what to make of that, given that in much of my life, that doesn't happen some regularly. But possibility, depending on what this turnout actually means, but it's not so clear yet what it does mean, I think.
Another point that I want to bring up is how to, watch election night. Like there's some people who say you should start drinking early. There's some people that say that you should start drinking rather late. For those who are deciding, when to really start hitting the hard stuff, and we look at election polling and exit polls and sort of those early results coming in, what are some cautions that you have in terms of like how to watch states and how to interpret early results? Jack, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, number one, wait, have patience, especially this year, because the early returns might be totally unrepresentative of the ultimate outcome. And the other thing to remember is every state is different in how it processes and counts votes. Florida, for instance, is already processing the early vote. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get an early count of the vote, but it's possible we'll know something about Florida fairly at a reasonable hour tomorrow night. And of course, if Biden carries Florida, that could have great significance for the rest of the race.
Sarah, something that's been talked about by President Trump on the campaign trail and sort of the closing days of the election is he's been sort of questioning the idea about results that come in after election day. There's this notion that that's being put out there by the Trump campaign that somehow if there are any results that come after midnight on election day, somehow they're suspect. How should we be interpreting or thinking about ballots coming in and thinking about what comes after Tuesday?
Sure. Thank you so much. I think even just today, President Trump said that if he would be very ready and willing to challenge, bring a legal challenge against the counting of votes that come in after Election Day. This is of course a key challenge that we're facing, kind of from a democratic perspective, right? We're under the time period of this pandemic in which most states are pushing mail-in ballots, and yet we see all of these kinds of restrictions being placed on the counting of those ballots as they're coming in. So I think that there's a lot to be said for this concern that if a ballot arrives late, that it would somehow be suspect. At the end of the day, I think that there's a real need for people's ballots to be counted.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to point out this at this point, it feels like, we're learning so much about the electoral process, from how to request an absentee ballot to how they're counted to when they're counted. We could all become, I think, junior county clerks, and from as much as we've learned about this process. And I think one of the things that we should point out as junior county clerks is the difference between canvassing and certifying an election. And I think this is something that's really getting conflated by Trump's comments, is that the canvass is the count. And in states, they actually set by law when the canvass takes place and when the Secretary of State or whatever authority actually certifies the election. That is to say, determines who the winner is and stops the count. Like, for instance, in Pennsylvania, they have to certify the election pretty early compared to a lot of other states. They have to decide by November 11th. But the idea that they would continue the canvass after election night, particularly if things were close, not controversial in the slightest. And of course, those of us who live in California and have had to deal with California elections returns, we know how late that can go. In fact, California, they don't have to certify their elections till December 11th. Now, of course, we're not probably waiting on anything of national import here in California, but if California was, the election was riding on California, we could be guessing our way to December if things were particularly close. Andy, do you have a comment?
Yeah, well, I just thought I would also add that we're probably expecting a legal challenge to counting mail ballots that arrive in Pennsylvania after Election Day in that 3-day window. And it's not clear how long that legal challenge will take. So that could run into issues with the deadlines in Pennsylvania. And I think that's probably the biggest election wildcard this year is what will become of that challenge if it turns out to be a pivotal thing.
Yeah, it's absolutely. In fact, the Pennsylvania Secretary of State is segregating ballots depending on when they arrived. If they arrive after Election Day but are postmarked by Election Day, they're going to be segregated and set aside in case there is a legal challenge. And Jack, I know one thing that you've said in Gov 20 is there's 3 things you need in politics, at least in New York, and that's guns, lawyers, and money. But in this case, it seems that we just need a lot of lawyers. Are you anticipating? I mean, we're seeing it already. I think cases everywhere. But I mean, are you anticipating a long slog like we saw in 2000 coming out of this election?
Well, your identification in 2000 points to the key variable, the closeness of the outcome. If it is a massive victory by one candidate or another, and if it's a massive victory, it will probably be by Biden, then the significance of the legal challenges won't be quite as great. It's possible that Biden could win by a margin where he doesn't even need Pennsylvania. If it's fairly close, if one state is pivotal, as Florida was in 2000, totally different story. And a lot of people are going to be focused on Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So we need to keep an eye on that. And again, the key variable here is the margin. Is somebody going to win so big that a single state isn't going to make the difference?
Yeah, in terms of thinking about states to watch, I mean, I'll challenge you all to give me your predictions. You don't have to, but I'm going to at least give you the opportunity. But in terms of states to watch, yeah, I mean, if Florida is a decisive victory, it's an early night. You can tuck yourself in. If we're all panicking about Florida, it's going to be a long night and maybe a long determination of the election. Sort of moving on a little bit, keeping on the same thing though about the Trump campaign. Going back to the early presidential primaries and thinking about March and April and into May, and the growing COVID numbers and the kind of attempts by various secretaries of state and elections authorities to try to cope with this so that turnout wouldn't drop. And one of the things that many states were attempting to do was to have mail-in ballots. And Trump, from an early moment, basically started to question the legitimacy of mail-in ballots. And sort of absentee ballots have been in question here for months now. And we're heading into an election where in many states, there actually were fairly generous regulations about who could receive an absentee ballot. Sarah, how should we be concerned about this question of legitimacy of the mail-in vote, particularly because we see an early vote that's twice as large as it was in 2016?
Yeah, on this question of legitimacy, and I know President Trump has raised this many times, but at the end of the day, it's the states who have the authority to determine how they want to run their elections. So I think when we come back to this sort of key federalism piece, we see that there's this kind of conflict, right, between the federal government and the embodied by the President of the United States, suggesting that there's some problem with mail-in ballots, while the states themselves are pushing this agenda, as we saw from the map that you showed in the very beginning. The early voting is most certainly taking off. People are really excited to get out there and cast their ballots this year, particularly given the COVID situation and the ability to cast a ballot without having to go in person.
Yeah, Andy.
Well, and if I could just raise a follow-up issue on that as well. It's not clear how well the mail balloting is going to go. And I think one of the things that will make Pennsylvania a particularly interesting place to watch is this special rule about naked ballots, right? You have to get your ballot into the mail ballot into the privacy sleeve and then into the main thing and mail it back. And if you don't have the inner envelope, then your vote won't count. And I think looking across the country, every state has some interesting, quirky rule about what you have to do to fill out your mail ballot. And I think for people who study election administration, one of the big questions will just be how many of these ballots get invalidated? And we have absolutely no idea how many that's going to be. And it could be a very small percentage, or it could be a really significant percentage in some states.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I saw an article about Pennsylvania. There was a Friday deadline to challenge ballots that had been submitted in Pennsylvania. And they're actually vanishingly few. And they were mostly done on terms of who was able to vote. That is to say, if you were a resident in the county and following other Pennsylvania requirements. But there's still plenty of other challenges yet to come when the mail-in balloting comes. I think we all, for those of us, I think I'm officially old now because I, experienced 2000 firsthand. And I can talk about things like hanging chads with, a great deal of authority. But I think we all sort of are gripping ourselves for, maybe if a state is close, like Jack was saying, and things are uncertain, we fall into this trap again of trying to determine what's a vote. And that's a very scary proposition when this becomes a kind of state by state question, or if we're all worrying about how Pennsylvania, determines what's a vote and what's not. One other thing I want to talk about in terms of legitimacy is talking about mail-in balloting. And which party votes early and which party votes late. Something that we've seen in California, like I can say, thinking back to 2018 for those who were following the California House elections and the sort of blue wave that swept through. On election night, things looked not great for Republicans, but it actually took some weeks of counting before we saw that Democrats had actually won. And this made people sort of confused and unhappy. Why is it that these late ballots seem to be shifting results? And I think this is that something? Can you help us understand why that occurs in states like Pennsylvania and California?
Well, here in California, it's just traditionally that Democrats have taken their time with voting. And in previous elections, the Republicans tend to be the old white people, people like me. And, we turn in our ballots really early because this is exciting for us. It's basically the exciting thing we do all day if you're an old white person. But the psychology is different this year. Democrats have been hearing for months that, Trump's going to steal the election. You got to get the ballot in early, or Newman, the postal guy, is going to steal it from you. And so Democrats have been extremely diligent about casting their ballots early. Paul Mitchell made this point in an email. The question is election day vote. Are the Republicans going to bounce back on election day, both here in California and elsewhere, to make up for what appears to be a pretty significant Democratic lead in the early vote? Michael McDonald keeps a great website, and he looks at the early vote among the states that have party registration. And among those states, Democrats outnumber Republicans by about 50%. Now, California kind of distorts that because that's a large chunk of that total, but still Democrats seem to be voting earlier than Republicans. So tomorrow, if you see lots and lots of white people lined up at the polling places, then Republicans might be bouncing back.
Yeah, I want to share another visualization from that Washington Post tracker for early voting that starts in September 28th and goes through today. And it shows that, the earliest of the early voters, the majority were Democrats. And we can see as we move on here, Republicans slowly are coming up here to now represent about 34%. So it does look like Republicans are voting, but they're voting late, to your point, Jack. All right.
And if I can jump in
please,
here.
Sarah. Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think for many Democrats, they've been waiting for 4 years to vote. I think since the election of Donald Trump in 2016, we've seen Democrats as well as others within sort of the liberal wing, take to the streets, whether it was from the Women's March immediately following the inauguration of the president, to environmental protesters, to Black Lives Matter movements. I think there's just so much enthusiasm amongst the Democratic Party and others who are going to come out to vote and support for Biden. I think that's why you see this shift occurring this time in terms of those numbers.
And there's a strategic advantage that comes with doing that as well, which is that then you can track your ballot and see if it's counted. And so it may actually turn out that the voting earlier cuts down the error rate, which could be strategically important in a number of states.
It's also interesting how a number of states, California and Michigan, although Michigan has only done it a day ahead, but many states like Pennsylvania, you can't touch the ballots until election day. You can't count them. But in California, county authorities are now able to do this in a two-step process where they're tabulated but not counted. You won't be able to actually look at what the computer says until election day, but a lot of the early voting is actually, already done. Michigan has allowed it a day in advance. It was kind of a compromise. So that, in Michigan, they're actually counting ballots today, which means they'll make progress, but it doesn't mean that they'll be done. But like in Florida, Florida can start counting once they receive them. So there's a lot of variation in the way in which states count these absentee ballots that also affects the ways in which the results are reported. And I think it'll make a big difference as we think about, a huge mail-in early voting kind of election that we're seeing this year. Speaking, I think the ghost of 2016 haunts our elections talk. So why don't we talk a little bit about how 2020 is actually different than 2016? Because, you wouldn't be too far off to say that in some respects, this election looks a lot like the last election, particularly the sort of barnstorming Trump, going from rally to rally. When you think about Democrats who are very nervous, maybe eyes are open a little wider, but still nervous about states like Pennsylvania. And it's obvious that Joe Biden is spending a lot of time in Pennsylvania as we're heading into election day. But to give our audience a little context, what are some ways in which this election is different than 2016?
Well, for starters, Biden's lead. Biden has had a very steady lead, around 10%, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. But the polling average since March has very consistently favored Biden. Go back 4 years, Clinton was ahead, but by a much smaller margin and a much more variable margin. Another related variable is favorability. it's pretty clear Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were extremely unpopular candidates. They had very low favorability ratings, and it was a choice of the lesser of two evils. Lots of people like Joe Biden, and he simply does not arouse the same level of hatred as Hillary Clinton. Lately, Trump has been saying things like, Joe Biden is going to take away religion, to which Biden said, next time a Republican says about me, I'm going to shove my rosary down their throat. That's not taking hold at all. Doesn't mean that Trump can't win, but Biden is in a much stronger poll position than Hillary Clinton was.
Speaking of polls, Andy, there was a lot of talk in 2016 about how the polls got it wrong. We were expecting things to be closer than they were, and state level polls were actually off by about 5%, which was pretty alarming. Clearly, a lot of people got things wrong. Did we learn any lessons from 2016 that we're applying in 2020?
We did. I think overall, first, I think people who do polling have gotten better at communicating about what it is that they do, right? That, we measure something with a fair amount of error. And if you measure it over and over again, it is true. If things are relatively stable, you can kind of, tighten things up a little bit. But, that it shouldn't actually be that surprising in 2016. Like Nate Silver said this so many times, he must be sick of it by now, right? That, somebody who had like a 1 in 3 chance of winning an election, like they won an election, given the distance the polls were. And I also think we've invested in polling differently. So I think there's been a lot more high quality investment in specific state polling rather than like national polling this year. So I think there's been different investments in polling. People have done weighting a little bit differently, which is where that your sample is not going to be like a perfect representation of the people that you've polled. And so you're going to adjust that sample to look like the population. And they're taking, people are doing more to take like levels of education into account, things like that. So I think there's a lot of work going on in that area. But more than, I think the risk in this election comes more from the election administration stuff, right? That you can only poll the people who think they're voting, but you don't really know, no one can actually really commit to that, like my vote is going to count, right? And so that's probably where more of the risk comes in. And that's something that you can never fix by better polling, right? If someone, has their vote discounted because they didn't use the privacy sleeve, or their ballot gets lost in the mail and it arrives late, they could have very honestly told you who they plan to vote for, and they could have attempted to do that. And so that's I think where more of the risk comes this time. There were still actually remarkably few high quality, late moving battleground polls in 2016. You can actually go back if you're interested. You can download all of the 538 database and play around with it yourself, which is a lot of fun. And you can see what's there. And it's just not as much as I think we have this year.
It's, for those of us who attend Twitter University, either full or part-time, one of the things I've been amused by on there is people retweeting things from 2016, which seems utterly unfair and completely entertaining. All the hot takes that were coming out about, there's no such thing as momentum, or, people coming back and saying, well, that aged well. So it's a lesson to all of us who are tweeting about elections predictions, I think. Another thing I wanted to talk about in terms of like differences between 2016 and 2020, there's a lot of emphasis or focus on undecideds in 2016. How should we be thinking about undecideds in 2020?
Well, I guess a big question is, are they even going to vote? Sometimes when people say they're undecided, that's a polite way of saying, I don't care, I'm not bothering. So that, I really don't think there are just that many sentient human beings who are undecided about this election.
Yeah, no, polling seems to show it too, that this is really more about turnout than it is about trying to get undecideds in there. Although, one would wonder, they always find these people though, Jack, like, after these debates where you've got Frank Lutz out there with his bad hairpiece, talking to all these different people that I don't know where they scrounge them up, but beforehand they're like, I don't know. And then afterwards, like even after the first debate, they're like, I don't know. I don't know who these people are, but they exist. I've seen them on TV. But I think the point is there's just not a lot of them this time around. Sara, any thoughts you have about differences between 2016 and today?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think one of the key pieces that we're not talking about here are demographic shifts. So I have some slides if you'd like to.
Oh, yes, please.
If I should share those. A lot of this is coming from the Pew Research Center. Let me go into presentation mode here. Right, so we can see that the face of America is changing rapidly, right? And Professor Pitney talked about, being the old white guy. Well, there's fewer and fewer of the old white guys, and more people of color who are becoming a part of the electorate here in the United States. And that was most certainly a trend that we were beginning to see in 2016, but that trend is continuing now into 2020. In fact, let me skip forward here. In 2016, they were the most diverse voters ever, and certainly that is going to continue to be the case when we begin to think about some of the key battleground states, particularly in the West, Arizona, and some of the key Senate races in Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, Florida. We're thinking about growing populations of Latinx voters. Even in some of these states, Asian American voters can most certainly come into play, particularly in some of the congressional districts that are happening on the ground in places like Texas and Georgia. We also see that as the baby boom generation is aging, millennials, right, are overtaking the baby boomers as the largest generation that we have. And most certainly millennials, as we've seen from a lot of the protests and things, of course, there's a lot of diversity there in terms of their partisan affiliations, but we've also seen millennials and Gen Z really be more involved in ways that we haven't seen in the past. I have plenty more to share with you, but I'll stop there and just simply say that I think demographics are one of the key pieces that we should be thinking about, both in terms of the presidential election as well as some of these key Senate and House races.
Thanks, Sara. That's really important. And I think it's also something that can help us maybe transition a little bit into talking about particular states that we like to watch and how they have changed since 2016. I'm going to put up a graphic of closing times for different states so we can get an idea of actually what's going to happen tomorrow. These are all in Pacific time. So for those of you who are on the East Coast, adjust accordingly. But by, let's see here, 4 o'clock Pacific time, we'll have most of Florida polls closed. And then by 5 o'clock, we'll have all of Florida's polls closed. Plus we'll have most of Texas and Pennsylvania. So as the night is unfolding here, what are some states that you all are watching, and what are you watching for? If you want to sort of say, this is the canary in the cage, or this tells me that I can, go to bed early.
Florida.
I was just about to say the softball is Florida, right?
Yeah, it's pretty obvious. 20 years ago, I was at KPCC doing election coverage with Mike Alvarez, who was Andy's advisor at Caltech. And, we thought, we had a fairly reasonable night. And then the numbers started changing rapidly, and we were there a long time. Florida is usually close. Late polls indicate Biden may be ahead, but again, for the reasons that we've discussed in terms of turnout, in terms of whose votes actually count, we don't know that for sure. But if Biden jumps out to a lead in Florida, and if the projections indicate that he's going to win, it'd be very, very hard for Trump to win at that point.
Other states that people are looking at?
I think in that early time slot, I'll be really interested to see what's coming out of Maine, because I think that will be important for mapping out some of the kind of oddball paths to Biden winning the presidency. Is that extra split vote from Maine can matter. And it's also an important race for controlling the Senate. And it's one of the few things that we'll get really from the East Coast other than Florida. Because some of the others, right? Georgia is going to be a very strange election because of the runoff and the likely runoff in the Senate race in Georgia. So like, if you want that to find out about that, you're going to have to wait until January 5th. And so that's going to be a while. And North Carolina allows for counting of ballots for an additional nine days, I think, something like this. Mail ballots coming in late in North Carolina, and so. Of the East Coast slot, that's really it. And then as we kind of move across the country, I think Arizona will be the big one. Because if Joe Biden doesn't win in Pennsylvania, a lot of the non-Pennsylvania routes involve Arizona in some way. And it's also got one of the critical Senate races.
Sara, anything to add?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I lived in Pennsylvania for nearly a decade, so of course we'll be following Pennsylvania closely. But as we've talked about already, it could be a little while before we get some final results there. I think Pennsylvania is an exciting place because it's a part of that Rust Belt that in 2016, looking at Michigan, Wisconsin that went to Trump, I think it'll be exciting to go back and take a look and see if Trump can maintain his hold there, or if Biden, who has a long history kind of in the Rust Belt region, can really push forward. I definitely agree with Andy that Arizona is the place to watch. That Senate race between Martha McSally and Mark Kelly. It's going to be exciting.
Speaking of Senate, let's get into Senate races. Setting out this election, there were a lot of seats that Republicans needed to defend, and I think initial thoughts were this election would favor Republicans for keeping control of the Senate. But things have obviously changed quite a bit. And now we have a laundry list of potential Senate races that are Republicans defending their seats, places that you wouldn't expect to be defending. Yeah. Jack, what's your read on these battleground Senate seats, and what do you see happening on election day?
Okay, that's my cue to go to the screen. Okay, let's see. Okay, this is my forecast. It's fairly similar to a forecast published in the Washington Post today by CMC alum Henry Olson. I'm slightly more bullish on Democratic prospects than Henry is, but basically we see things similarly. Maine, Democrats recruited a really strong candidate in Gideon, and Susan Collins has stuck to the middle of the road. And what's in the middle of the road except roadkill? So she's alienated Democrats, alienated Republicans. I'd be astonished if she hung on. Cal Cunningham in North Carolina was the early favorite against incumbent Tom Tillis. Then Cal Cunningham had a sex scandal. Everybody was saying, oh no, that's it, he's done. Guess what? They don't care about sex scandals anymore. And he's still ahead. I think he wins that. Georgia is a little iffier. I think Ossoff beats Perdue for the 6-year seat. The special election, I'm guessing that the Republicans might have an advantage in a special, but I wouldn't bet my kids' tuition on that. Obviously, here at CMC, a race that we're very interested in is Montana. Extremely tight. Some polls have incumbent Steve Daines ahead. The last couple of public polls had Steve Bullock ahead. but by only a point. That's about as close as it can get. My guess, and it's only a guess and absolutely untainted by my 32 years of friendship with Steve Bullock, is that Steve Bullock will pull it out at the end, again, on the wave of early voting, which, as we saw before, is already at 100% of the total 2016 level. I think Martha McSally goes down in Arizona. Appointed senators do not have a great track record of winning elections, particularly appointed senators who lost a previous Senate race. So McSally has been tested at the polls and found wanting. So I think at the end, Democrats will have a majority. Now, this could go both ways. Henry thinks it's going to be Democrats 50 with 2 seats going to run off in Georgia. That could happen. Conversely, some of the seats that we're looking at here as red, if Biden has a terrific night, if the demographics indicate a huge turnout by young people, big Democratic turnout by old people. We Altercockers are voting Democratic this year. People of color, and if there's historic turnout there, Democrats could have a great night. They could pick up South Carolina, even their outside chance at Texas, even Alaska, which has generally been a Republican state. There's an independent running basically as a Democrat there, has been able to raise a lot of money. So 2 bottom lines here. One, you mentioned at the beginning that Democrats were behind at the beginning. 2 things happened to boost the Democrats. One was tremendous fundraising. They've been astonished at how much they've been able to raise throughout this campaign. The second is recruitment. Initially, Steve Bullock was running for president, and Chuck Schumer really had to persuade him to run for Senate instead. Same in Colorado. Governor Hickenlooper ran for president. He got recruited, very strong candidate. Ossoff in Georgia. So the Democrats have raised a lot of money, and they've recruited really strong candidates. So my guess is they'll win the Senate. The question is by how much.
Thank you for that, Jack. Interesting point. There's been a lot talking about fundraising. There's been a lot of talk about just the overall fundraising totals in South Carolina, for example, which have been sort of eye-bulging. But one of the things I caught the other week, I don't know if it's still true, but I imagine that it is the spending in Montana. Speaking of Bullock, it's actually been the most per voter in any Senate race this year. Maybe it's affecting that turnout. Maybe that's why over 100% have voted. But there's been no shortage of cash spent in Montana on this race.
Yeah, it's as if Michael Bloomberg were on the ballot. Who comes out ahead? We'll have a better sense of that in a little over 24 hours.
Well, I think I'm going to save us all from having to make our predictions as this is recorded, and they would be, you thought elections Twitter was bad. Imagine this being rolled out and, being pilloried by our predictions. So why don't we move from our panel discussion into questions? And so I'm going to hand this over to our ATH fellows. You guys have been sending in, that is the audience has been sending in questions. They're being curated by our fellows, and they will be selecting and reading out those questions and addressing them generally to the panel. So Chris and Nadini, why don't you go ahead and take over?
Yeah, thank you so much. So the first question is from a student. Is there any chance of Mississippi going blue in the Senate?
Well, it's a Senate question, Jack. Over to you.
There's an outside chance. Mike Espy is a strong candidate, substantial amount of money in there. Mississippi is probably the most racially polarized state. Basically, all the white people vote Republican, all the black people vote Democrat. There are some exceptions. If Espy can crack the white vote a little bit, then he has a chance. I'd be a little surprised to see him win, but if it is a sweep tomorrow night, if we say, the networks are calling Florida for Biden by dinner time, our time, then that's the kind of thing that could happen.
Another question from a student asking, A lot of people have been wondering about the future of the Republican Party after Trump. Could the party be split into two factions of Trump supporters versus never Trump Republicans?
I'll try to take a little bit of a stab at that. I don't know that there will be a schism necessarily, but I do think there will be a fight for the soul of the Republican Party should Trump lose. I think there are a lot of Republican groups that have been organizing against Trump. The Lincoln Project probably being one of the ones that is most well known, but there's also Republican Voters Against Trump that have been that's run by Mike Murphy and a few other people. They're basically trying to push the approval rating for Trump with Republicans from 90 something to 80 something. And the idea is that if you can get enough Republicans peeled off, then they can win the election. And if Trump loses, I think there will be a sort of reckoning about what American conservatism is, what the Republican Party stands for. I think it'll happen first, of course, at an elite level, but one of the things that really troubles me is how this will play out sort of on the ground. The sort of knife and fork discussions about too much of this and too little of that happen between elites. I think, we see people boarding up cities. We see the idea that there's going to be civic or civil unrest on election day and thereafter. I think the stakes have already gone up about what the other side, the Republicans, are going to stand for. So I really don't know how that's going to play out. But I do think that how this election goes and how people react to it, Republicans in particular, if they delegitimize the election and make this a rallying cry on the ground, or if there's a kind of rout and it's pretty clear that Trump was, thoroughly and completely defeated, I think that's going to matter a lot for what comes later.
Why does polling suggest that President Trump will win a much higher share of the vote from racial minorities tomorrow than he did 4 years ago?
Andy, you want to tackle that one?
Sure. I think there are a couple of things to say about this. And the first is we're much better at getting large populations than small populations. And we're much better at surveying less diverse populations than more diverse populations. And so sometimes you get polls where you'll see like a large increase in the fraction of the vote in a particular community supporting a particular candidate. But you really need a lot of evidence to accumulate to believe that that's real. And in particular, one of the real challenges of doing survey work in a multilingual country in particular is it's a lot cheaper to survey in English only than to add in additional languages. And so having done a lot of California stuff, which I know Professor Sadhwani has done as well, and is an expert on this in California, right? Is that in some places you really would need to do surveying in multiple languages to really capture like the full group, and that you worry about like whether whole communities are included and things like that. So that's one where I think we'll need some additional evidence to back up the polling after the election, off voter files and other kinds of things like that, to try and pull together a really good answer.
If I can jump in as well, I think that you're absolutely right, Andy. And my sense is that when you do conduct a survey, right, then that data is weighted. So even if you have a couple of voices, who are saying one thing that could potentially get amplified. I think that was my understanding is that's what happened in the USC poll back in 2016, which polled, and I believe only had 1 or 2 African Americans. One was a Trump supporter, and that voice got amplified in that survey. But that's not to say that people of color communities are monoliths by any means. Certainly, there's a lot of variation that exists in many communities of color. That being said, the trend for African Americans, Blacks, Latinx, even for Asian Americans, has most certainly been trending towards Democrats and Democratic candidates since the 2016 election and for quite some time before as well. So I think all indications continue to suggest that communities of color would continue in that direction. I actually we just finished a survey of Indian Americans in the field. It just closed on Friday. We're busy analyzing that, but there's been a lot of talk, especially with Kamala Harris being on the vice presidential slot with Biden, about the extent to which Indian Americans may or may not actually support her, and that there's a Hindu nationalist movement that's going on with the Howdy Modi rally back in Texas last year. Preliminary analysis, it's not going to have a huge effect. While there's a small proportion of Indian Americans who might have that perspective, the overwhelming majority are continuing to support Democrats, which has been the case for many years.
And also, Trump has always liked to brag that he did so much better among African Americans than Romney did. Well, Romney got 3% of the vote. You almost automatically are going to do better than that. In 2012, there were precincts in New York City where Romney literally got zero votes. Usually, he'll get some votes by mistake. No. African American voters in New York were really, really, really careful not to vote for Romney by mistake. So it's not difficult to beat that baseline.
Do you see this election as a broader trend of the US becoming more blue, or is this year an exception?
Interesting question. I think it sort of remains to be seen. I mean, I not to bring elections theory into this and say, is this some sort of realigning election, or even to talk about that theory, but I do think American politics is at a moment of an inflection point at the very least. And I do think that the outcome of this election matters more than other elections in terms of the future of the political parties. I mean, if, for example, I talked for a while before about the future of the Republican Party, should Trump lose, but if Biden wins, and it seems at least likely now that that's a possibility, I think there's also going to be somewhat of a battle for the Democratic soul. I don't think that Biden winning is necessarily going to extinguish a lot of disagreement between progressives and moderates in the Democratic Party. And I think there's going to be a battle for the composition of the cabinet, for example. I know that Elizabeth Warren has already said that she's lobbying for being Secretary of the Treasury. There's going to be a lot of pressure put on Biden to appoint certain people to the cabinet, to follow a certain party line. And so, I think both parties, this is an inflection point, and moving out of this election, win or lose, I think we're going to see big changes on both sides.
Which group, elderly, young?
Sorry, Sarah, did you have a comment about that question as well?
I spend a lot of time studying California politics, and there's an old saying, so goes California, goes the nation. I think a lot of folks in California are thinking back to a similar inflection point here in California politics around Prop 187 in the 1990s. Around the Pete Wilson run for the governor, and that proposition, which looked to really clamp down on immigrant communities, set off Latino communities to naturalize, to get involved, to mobilize like they had never before. And today, California is a very strong blue state. Latinos are, really are a very important part of the legislature, and the Latino caucus has a very influential and powerful role in the state. So I'm very curious to see what happens in terms of the outcome of this election and the kind of inflection, the kind of reflections that will occur following.
If I could jump in on the back of that as well, actually, there's this really wonderful book that Hans Noel wrote about parties and ideologies, right? And how these are different kinds of coalitions. And I think a lot of the lesson that I took away from this really wonderful book about the way that ideological coalitions are created is that they're actually done through intellectual endeavor. They're done by people who exchange ideas and create new coalitions. And so a lot of this isn't determined, I think, about what happens next. And a lot of it, I think this is an exciting time to be a student interested in politics, right? Because a lot of it is like, you actually get to participate in deciding. by what you write and who you talk to and how you engage with the political process. And I think that'll be a very exciting moment, one way or the other, right? Whether Trump wins this election or if Biden wins this election, that I think both sides will have to sort of go through this moment of thinking about what is to come.
Great. So which group, elderly, young, Black, Hispanic, or college-educated women, will make the biggest difference in the election in battleground states?
It's quite a list there. I'll just weigh in quickly on Florida and seniors, if you want a sort of a quick one. Trump was leading with seniors in 2016 by something like 16 points. He's not this election. We haven't mentioned COVID yet, which is kind of remarkable. We're almost at the top of the hour. Maybe it's just sort of, to use a bad analogy, the air that we breathe. But seniors have not reacted very well to Trump's handling of the situation. They're the most vulnerable population. And I think particularly in Florida, which is a very important state and has a tremendous elderly population and a swing state on top of it, that's something that's made a big difference. And it may make a big difference to the outcome of the election, is how Trump has really lost seniors there.
If maybe I could add a slightly different category, I would suggest parents of small children, which is very much a product of COVID. But if there is anybody in America these days who is mad as hell and not going to take it anymore, it's been someone whose kids are at home with them and have been stuck home with them for like a year. And I think that is a sort of underrated constituency.
As a mom of three, I absolutely agree.
Thank you, everyone. We had a bunch of questions, but unfortunately didn't have time to get to all of them. But thank you for answering the questions that we were able to ask. On behalf of Claremont McKenna College and the Athenaeum, thank you all for joining us tonight. A special thanks to Professors Corser, Pitney, Sadhwani, and Sinclair, as well as all those who sent in questions. Don't forget to join us for our next Virtual Ath event, which will be on Tuesday, November 10th at 5 p.m. Pacific. Professor Charles Mills, or philosopher Charles Mills, whose work addresses social class, gender, and race in moral, social, and political philosophy, will be in conversation with members of the philosophy department at CMC. Thank you and have a good evening.